Thank you so much to Common Sense Media for having me here today and following such a vibrant and vigorous discussion. It's a little intimidating after the breadth of that discussion to go and speak about my own experience, but I serve as a commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission. So every day I have a front row seat at the digital revolution. And every day I think a little bit about digital equity. And to me, digital equity means no matter who you are, no matter where you live, and no matter where you go to school, you need access to modern communications to have a fair shot at 21st century success. But digital equity is still a little bit wonkish. Talking about the digital divide is a little sleep-inducing. Well, maybe not for the people here, but when you get outside of this room. And so I like to try to bring it back to something that's real world. And oddly enough, that's homework. You see, when I was growing up, all you needed for homework was paper, a pencil, and my brother leaving me alone. And of course, it was that third one that was the really hard part. But today, the world has changed. There's data out there that show that 7 in 10 teachers require internet access with the homework they assign. But data from the Federal Communications Commission consistently demonstrates that 1 in 3 households do not have internet access. And where those numbers overlap is what I call a homework gap. And the homework gap exists in rural America, in urban America, and in everything in between. In fact, according to the Senate Joint Economic Committee, there are 12 million students in this country who fall into the homework gap and lack the regular broadband access they need to just do nightly schoolwork. And from my perspective, this is the cruelest part of the digital divide. And it's a divide we're going to have to address and a gap we're going to have to fix. But if those numbers don't really make it vivid for you, let me tell you a little bit about some folks that I've met as I've gone around the country in this role. I spent time with students in Texas, in Oak Hill, which is near downtown Dallas, who described to me how the only place they could get their internet service was at a fast food restaurant. And so night after night, they would slide into a booth and do their homework with a side of fries. I spoke with students in Pennsylvania who said they couldn't get service where they lived, so their parents would concoct these really complicated plans to make sure that they got to friends and relatives' homes on nights they had to do research or type papers or access online learning materials. And that it was every week they would figure out how they could try to schedule this and make it happen. And then I think the story that stays with me most is one from Hatch, New Mexico. I went there a while back with Senator Tom Udall, and Hatch is a rural community far south of Albuquerque. It's beautiful and mystical, and the soil is really dry because it's where the famous Hatch chilies are grown. And in this underpopulated area, there is a big school, and students come from miles away in this rural community. And we met Jonah, who was a strapping football player, and he described to us how where he lived, they had no internet access. And he also really liked playing on the football team. So when school was over, he'd load all this equipment onto a bus, and they'd go out and play games against another school. But if you live in rural America, you're going to be on a bus for a long time to reach that other school, an hour and a half. And then he would go play that football game, return to the bus with all of his teammates and all of his equipment, and they would drive back home to Hatch, and they would let all the students out in a dark parking lot at night. And he would go take a borrowed laptop and sit under the lights in the parking lot and do his homework because it was the only place that he had a reliable internet signal. And I'm going to submit to you that in the United States of America, we can do a lot better than that. We're going to have to come up with policies that fix the problem of digital equity and address the homework gap. And it's been something that I've focused on during my tenure at the FCC, and I'm proud to say we've made some progress, but we haven't made enough. And I'd like to now introduce the panel that's coming up here, who's going to talk about their thoughts about digital equity, digital citizenship, and I hope they'll offer some ideas about how we address the homework gap. And I can't leave this stage as a woman who works in technology without acknowledging this is an all-female panel. That doesn't happen very often. So thank you, Common Sense.
But as we're waiting, why don't we start introductions? My name is Amina Fazlullah, and I'm Digital Equity Counsel with Common Sense Media. And we've been focusing on all the various ways that we can support kids and families in making sure that they are connected to the internet, but also given the right tools to succeed and make the best use of the internet as well. I'll let my panelists introduce themselves.
Hi, everybody. I'm Lisa Guernsey. I run the Learning Technologies Project at New America, and I'm a former reporter who's been working on ed tech issues for a long time. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Rachel Barr. I'm at Georgetown University, and I've been studying how young children learn from media for the past 20 years, and also sort of thinking about the family media ecology and how is media being used within families, by parents, by children.
Hi, my name is Tina Plaza, and I work for Child Trends. I don't know whether you guys are familiar with us, but we do have a project that I work on, Child Trends News Service, where we take research from people like Rachel Barr, and we turn it into television newscasts, like a minute 30 little stories. And we target that to an audience, lower income audiences, because they need that information. So we'll talk more about that.
Great. So why don't we start off our discussion with a little bit about what digital equity actually is. I feel like it's a term that may not be as familiar to the audience. As the commissioner said, it's something that people are still trying to get to know. For a long time in DC, we've been talking about digital divide, which tends to focus in on just the access component, just the infrastructure component of folks who are connected and unconnected. So turning to my panelists, how would you describe what does digital equity actually mean?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and start. And I also just want to say thank you for inviting me for this. This has been quite a day. There's a lot of wide-ranging conversation, and to be able to bring it down to a level of like what can we do in our communities is really important. Because I think as anybody who has children today can see, digital equity is all around us, and it's not something that's just about whether a child or a student has a connection to the internet or not. That is not the issue anymore. It's whether, there's a whole host of issues obviously, but it's whether they have the access that they need, as Commissioner Rosenworcel described so beautifully, to be able to get their homework done. It's a lot of discussion around different populations and where the barriers may be for those populations, and being able to have the access not only to the networks, but also to people around them who can help them learn from all the material that's streaming at them and help them make good choices in doing that. And at some point, I'm happy to talk more about some programs that we've been doing in Maryland that are trying to overcome some of these digital divides through mentorship, as well as, of course, connection.
Yeah, I agree entirely. There's also now a growing information divide. So you might have, just because 97% of people have got cell phones, doesn't necessarily mean that how they're using them is going to be helpful for their child's development, or that it's easy to find the content or access the content or even pay for the access to the content. So everybody may have a device, but access to content and quality content is another really big gap. And there's a number of different populations who really have no access at all. And one group that I want to bring up that is often completely ignored is the prison population. And prisoners, there are 2.2 million children in the United States who have incarcerated parents. And those parents have got very little access to technology, access to connections. And so I'd like to talk a little bit more about that community and their children.
And one of the things that she brought up is the fact that many of these communities don't have information to the best research. So what we're doing is we figured out that a lot of the lower income communities get most of their information from television news. And so what we started doing is I would find researchers. For example, one of my stories was with Rachel Barr, and she did something on technology because that's a huge topic for us, and we've covered several stories on that. And I go to her, and she gives me the research that she did, and I don't understand any of this, and so the viewers are not going to understand any of this. So can we, make it more lay language? And so we have a partnership with Ivanhoe Broadcasting News, which syndicates all our stories to about 119 stations who take our stories, and they run across the country. And so this is a way that we're getting people who don't have access to this research information that they really, really need. For example, we've done the good, the bad, and the ugly on technology. What's good about it is FaceTime with grandma. What's bad about it is less sleep. So we've done several of those stories, and a lot of researchers don't trust us at the beginning because they think, what are you going to do with my research? It took me 5 years to do this, and you want to make it into a minute 30 little story for television news? And so that's why what's great about our project is that we work with the researchers, say, okay, we need to say this in another way, and we need to keep it, very, very short. And so we've been very successful in the first year. This is our second year that we're doing this, and we're looking forward to continuing to do this.
And I think the other amazing thing is that this is not just done in English either.
Oh, it's done in Spanish too. Yeah, we do Spanish language television stations. Ivanhoe Broadcast News has been around for 35 years, and they don't like for us to have too much control. So I'm sort of like the go-between because I've worked in television news and I work with a research organization. So I tell the researcher, you cannot tell me how they're going to write this sentence, but you can talk to me about scientific accuracy, and then I'll go back to Ivanhoe and they'll accept that. So it's a great collaboration between researchers and television news. And we're just building more trust with the researchers, I think. And this is really vital information that we're relaying to the public and to television viewers.
So you talked a little bit about, Rachel, the populations that are impacted by digital equity or the lack thereof. Can we have a little bit of discussion of who is impacted by digital equity and how does that impact their lives?
Right, so as the Commissioner mentioned, rural communities are often very impacted by spotty connectivity and quite frankly long bus rides in terms of going back and forth to school. In urban districts, connectivity can also be very incomplete as well. The other groups, often minority or non-English speaking, so this is why I think that the TV project from Child Trends is so important, because getting access to information in Spanish is also another additional piece. And yeah, who else?
And I was just going to jump in and say, absolutely, the recognition that we need a lot more materials in different languages. Our families today are incredibly diverse, and what the conversations that are happening at home are not always in English, and yet the delivery of information through websites and apps is almost always, putting a lot of preference on English. There's also, just across these populations, a low-income, high-income divide. And so there is data that we have from the Joan Gans Cooney Center that did a national survey of families that are in the low-income bracket, under a median of about $65,000 a year, who have children. And how connected are those families? And many of them are doing what they can. All families today are doing what they can for kids. But 23% of those families do not have any kind of high-speed access at home. So it's mobile-only access that they have. And that's why we see some of these homework gap stories, absolutely. It's that these families are trying every avenue they can of going to the McDonald's. And I think this is actually where we can get into a policy conversation. They're going to their libraries, And they're finding access at points like that are kind of community anchors in communities, and that need to be open in longer hours and need to have more services for them. But they are trying to do what they can for their kids, but it is incredibly expensive to be getting the high speed that they need in their homes.
So one of the pieces that you guys have all highlighted is that we need more support information for families, for caregivers, for kids to be able to better utilize access when they do actually get it. So what are some examples of the type of information they need, or how do we get that into their hands? You've already given a great example with the television project. Are there others?
Well, Common Sense Media is the obvious first one, but one group that is really focused on very young children is 0 to 3, and 0 to 3 has done a recent set of tools for parents and for childcare providers. This is another group that we haven't sort of talked about. Childcare providers really need information on how to use media with children under 5 years of age too. So 0 to 3 developed these screen sense materials, and it has very basic things like tips on how to use video chat. You can use video chat much more effectively if you just use a couple of engaging ways to talk with children, and that can be a really good way for parents to interact if they've got like multiple jobs and they want to check in with their kids, but how to do that in a way that the child doesn't run away. Or how to pick content. That is one of the biggest difficulties. So Common Sense Media has got a lot of information for older children, and then Screen Sense is really just thinking right from the beginning, how do you think about what is educational media? What sorts of things can you sort of look for? What is active minds-on learning? So we know a lot from the science of learning about how children can learn. So how can we translate that into digestible materials for parents so that they can choose quality content for their children? And that's what 0 to 3 is trying to do. And the AAP is also doing things like creating family media plans. So how do you sort of figure out what your day is like? And so there could be screen limits, that's one way to do it. But what about if you flip it the other way and think about all the things that you want your child to do and achieve during the day? Go to the park, talk to their sister, go to school, and then think about at the end of the day, where might media fit in and sort of fit into your life and your time in different days and different times. So I think there's lots of ways that tools can be built to better empower parents to sort of allow them to think about mindful media use. Even and especially with populations where there is so much going on, multiple jobs, thinking about food insecurity, thinking about work schedules, all of these other things, but then sort of giving some tools to think about how tech might help rather than hinder in their lives.
And I had mentioned earlier libraries, and we've been seeing this more through some research we're doing at New America, but across lots of different avenues that are looking at the educational ecosystems that families are in. Libraries can be a real conduit for parents to be able to gain access to these tips and guides. They can also help parents to feel like someone kind of cares about their own situation because they're in their community. So what we've been seeing bubbling up across libraries around the country is a new role for librarians. They are transitioning in their role from librarians to media mentors. And this concept of being a media mentor is really catching fire. The American Library Association and the Library Services to Children organization have put out white papers on this. There's trainings that librarians are now having. The program that I'm involved in Maryland is a peer coaching model where librarians are teaching each other and observing each other, working with families and critiquing each other on, am I working in a way that's really helping this family and communicating and getting to them where they are? Am I giving them what they need to know about the use of digital media and how it can help and how it can harm? I'm asking them the right questions that are going to put them on a path to discovery and learning for their children. And the more that we can use those kind of professionals in our libraries, and also, of course, in our schools, although our teachers have a lot to do already, for sure, but the more that we can use those educators who are around our children and families, the more we may be able to really start bridging some of these divides and those mentorship divides. Using tools like the ones that we've heard described here are just amazing, and librarians can help connect families to the 0 to 3 resources and to the Common Sense Media resources.
I would
I would ask though, are you working with all kinds of libraries, like in different communities? Or, because for example, my community has a wonderful library where they teach you media, you can do anything at that library. But I think that it's a lot like schools are, where if you're in a poor community, the schools, aren't as well equipped as they are in better.
So this is exactly why I think there's an equity issue around this, and a real funding conundrum and issue as well. Libraries certainly want to do more for their communities, and we need our under-resourced libraries to be able to help our under-resourced families.
Exactly.
And we need to be kind of directing the funding in a way that enables those libraries to be able to offer all of these things.
There's actually one other group that I think about. We talk a lot about parents, and when we talk about parents, oftentimes we're thinking of mothers. And so I just want to throw in sort of a idea for one way to maybe maximize father involvement as well is via tech, because fathers are sort of more responsive. There's been a number of different studies that have sort of shown that tech approaches to fatherhood engagement, to fatherhood programs have actually been relatively effective. So improving father involvement via tech, particularly for low resource families, is another way to support families and sort of reduce some other inequities as well.
So there's another group at the table when we talk about digital equity. They're obviously policymakers, they're the parents and the families and the kids themselves. But there's also the tech companies and the infrastructure companies. How can they be more supportive in building a better digital equity environment?
There's a lot they can do, I think. I think it ranges from everything we've been talking about here today and really recognizing their responsibility. But also algorithmic bias that we were talking about earlier is a really important issue to be putting on the table, and for tech companies to be really looking more closely at who are their programmers and what are their backgrounds and what kinds of biases are they bringing to the table. I'll just put out one more though, and I'm sure that you guys have lots as well. As someone who's been following the policy issues in education, and particularly in early education, I see a real divide right now between where the investment is going. So there's a lot of investment and excitement around artificial intelligence and research for artificial intelligence. And yet we have preschool teachers who are making barely minimum wage and who are at poverty level. The investment in human intelligence and helping to create our human intelligence is really missing. So where can tech companies come into this? They can help to advocate for and be a force for change in our early education systems and helping to advocate for better policies and better funding. It's not just to help themselves as tech companies, but also just to help the communities.
And sort of building off of that, one of the things that we know, particularly for young children, is that joint media engagement is one of the most effective ways for children to sort of develop these more healthy media diets, develop ways to sort of think about, okay, I'm going to turn off the TV now. What does this mean? How does this connect back to my life? So really investing in childcare providers and parents and sort of supporting them use tech will also help in terms of thinking about that trajectory, and then this research taking this longitudinal approach to see how those trajectories might help. And then also investing in people sort of helping figure out the content. But from the tech side, what the tech side has to do, I'm going to draw on some of Jenny Rodesky's work. Jenny Rodesky has done a lot of work on apps and particularly children's apps where they can be put in things like terms like grinding, where a child has to go through a number of different steps in order to get to the different level in a free app, and that keeps them on the device for longer. And as we heard at the beginning of the day, the metric of success is time on the app. And so if you can build and design an app that keeps a child on it, then you're going to be more successful on the tech side. So if there was a way that we could even encourage tech developers to think about different metrics. What would be another metric of success might be if a child is able to solve the +1 problem more quickly and get on to a multiplication problem or a different sort of math problem. So is there any way that sort of tech developers can think about their design in terms of what is the outcome for the child, but that tech companies can incentivize them for that? Because at the moment, the metric of time on app is absolutely supporting the design of these practices that we know are very unhelpful in terms of children learning from apps. When we know that they also can be, if they're designed in the right way, they can gain a great deal. And particularly kids who are in lower resourced environments where there may not be as much time, or the schooling provisions may not be as good, we can sort of take advantage of tech, but not if the tech doesn't have incentives to develop the content that kids really need.
Yeah, I agree.
Rachel, you had mentioned applications for vulnerable populations like families who have a member incarcerated. How can tech build tools that take into account the unique needs of vulnerable populations? So sometimes this could be access, sometimes it could be unique needs.
Right. So I'll just do a quick description of one program that I have worked on that's called Just Beginning. And what we did in that program, it's for incarcerated teen fathers in order to increase their contact with their own babies. And part of the issue with visitation, we know that family engagement really reduces recidivism, it reduces behavioural incidents within prisons, it makes people release more easily, and so these are all really good outcomes from a justice point of view. So what we did is we just took Sesame Beginnings videos. These are little videos that show positive models, so TV, very simple. We showed them to the teen fathers as a model for positive parenting because they didn't necessarily have a lot of models themselves. And I show all these kids that are, incarcerated, and I show them a clip of Elmo, baby Elmo and his dad. And first of all, they start all smiling, and I say to them, well, why are you smiling? And the dad's in this room, these incarcerated teen youth, his dad says to me, I think I could play that with my little girl and she would really love that game. And so this is a strength that the youth have. They were instantly able to see the connection in terms of playing with their kids. We could show them this brief video, and then the child comes in, plays with the dad, they have a successful interaction in a playroom. And this type of programming can be sort of used to enhance interventions because quality programming can be developed and then can be used in these different situations. So for these incarcerated teen fathers, this was really a good way to start their relationship with their babies. For adult facilities, there's now video chat availability, which can also be a good way to keep parents and children connected, better than letters and phones, because babies under 2 don't understand phone calls at all. And obviously they can't read. So for babies under 5, again, remembering this is 2.2 million children in this country who are affected by this, video chat could be a good way to connect. The big inequity there, however, is that for every minute of video chat time, the incarcerated parent has to pay. So this is a very, so in my view, this is a very inequitable thing, because there could be a lot of really positive outcomes and reductions in incarceration if these family engagement practices could be amped up. So I would really love to see more investment in family engagement practices within the justice system, thinking about how to use tech. And can I do one more story? Okay, one more story is just because this is a dad story, and we have this intervention where we use this app called Dad Time, and there was this group of dads, and they were standing in the parking lot, and the other dad was on the other side of the parking lot, and they yell out to him and they say, and on this app there's a little tree, and every time the dad has more activities with the baby, they get more branches on their tree. So the one group of dads yells out to the dad on the other side of the parking lot and says, "Hey, how's your tree going?" And so this is a way to this was a really engaging way for fathers, but it also reduced burden in terms of the intervention, because it helped in scheduling appointments, it helped in communicating between co-parents. So I think there's so many promising ways that apps could be used to enhance interventions if we, and there are so many great tech developers out there, like brilliant people who develop tech that really, I'm sure, will come along for this right.
If I could just jump in. What I love about this example, and actually Tina's as well, and this is something we've been looking at in New America, is that it's a human-powered, tech-assisted approach, where the human is the first part of it. The connection, the interaction between babies and their dads is the first and most important piece, and the technology is used to assist in that, but it is not the centerpiece. And so how can we continue to kind of move the conversation, invest, and absolutely kind of applaud and uphold the technology that's really helping us to connect, but ensure that the human connection is the first part. And that's what we know from the learning, the science of learning, what we know from education outcomes on children of all different populations, is that they need that social interaction to be able to learn about the world, to make better decisions, to be able to kind of think clearly about what they're doing next, and on and on.
And this has really sort of been the theme of today, is sort of the power of relationships supported by the power of technology.
Yeah. It's a tool, but not using it as a tool. I just wanted to add one other thing, that this Child Trend News Service, one other thing we do is we're doing research with those communities on these stories. So we take these stories, we show them to a focus group, and then they give us feedback about what they think of the stories. Did they learn anything? Did they go too fast because they're a minute 30? And so we're starting to get more and more information about how to reach these communities. For example, for the Latino community, they don't like to be addressed with gaps. Oh, the Latino community is, 10% behind whites when it comes to math and so on. They want to be addressed with their strengths, and how can they take those strengths and do better. So we're learning a lot too about how to address these communities, not just giving them these stories, but how to address them and how to get them to learn from what we're giving them.
So I'll turn to maybe a more difficult part of the conversation. So what can we do about that? We have had policymakers in the audience today and on the stage. What are some of the suggestions that we can give to policymakers, or what are some of the things they're doing already that is supporting digital equity?
Well, I will say that first and foremost is to recognize that the appropriations in the budget, even in our federal budget that's happening right now, really matter. And so the fact that right now the Trump proposed budget eliminates federal funding for libraries and eliminates Title IV of our Early and Elementary and Secondary Act, which is funding a lot of our after-school programs that help to mentor youth. That's a disaster waiting to happen. So making sure that those appropriations actually go forward is a policy number one. But I also think that the legislation that Senator Markey mentioned at the very beginning, CAMRA, Child and Media Research Advancement Act, is a really important piece to be putting into the policy picture, because we don't actually have enough data on what's happening over time. And so those two alone would make a difference. Absolutely, right? And to look at that in each population.
At-risk groups, we really need to know about these trajectories. So what happens if we do engage and we do develop these healthy media diets? Is that going to be buffering versus if children are still getting this media content that is so filled with all of these other ways to just keep them on a screen rather than to learn from a screen or to interact via a screen. So the kids policy, I obviously think the camera idea is a brilliant idea and it's so well needed. Researchers love it. But I think, for our whole community and our whole society, it is absolutely essential that we really focus on all populations and sort of not forget about everybody and how it's impacting people differentially.
And then I think, and Amina, you can maybe tell us a little bit more about this as well, but Senator Murray is looking at digital equity from a lot of these different facets as well, and recognizing that it's not just about, is there an internet line that goes to a house or to a building? Instead, what is the infrastructure around it? And the more that we can recognize that human capital is part of that infrastructure, needs to be part of that legislation, I think the more that we can really start closing the equity gaps.
Yeah, I think that the policies that are on the table, like Senator Murray's legislation, it looks into the next step beyond access. It looks at, how do you support states in making their planning decisions around broadband, so it includes issues of digital inclusion and digital equity. And then how do you support the groups that are on the ground doing this work, the anchor institutions that are doing this hard work, putting a human face on this very technical problem.
Right.
I was just going to say that one of the big obstacles, though, of getting information from some of these communities is a lot of them are afraid to speak to researchers nowadays.
Yes,
So that's something that we've come across.
When we were doing the Maryland project with the libraries and counties across Maryland, we started by going out to talk to families and doing small focus groups with families, parents who had their children in Head Start, and early Head Start centers, and the Judy centers, which are preschool and kind of birth to 5 program in Maryland. And doing it in a way that was much more about hearing what they wanted than preaching and kind of expecting them to kind of like have some sort of answer, right? So it can be more of a conversation. And I think then you can help to have them recognize that their voice really matters and they can get more involved and they can start to influence policy. But you're absolutely right. It feels incredibly intimidating. And I mean, and as a privileged parent, I have no time. If I had multiple jobs and was working a shift, until 10 o'clock at night at Target, I really would have no time, right?
Exactly.
I mean, so recognizing what these families are under is a big
Don't
piece
talk
of-
down to them.
Yeah,
Kind of just appreciate where they're coming from, I think.
So we should open up to questions. It seems like there are a few questions in the room.
Did we want to mention though one? Can I just mention one last
Sure,
thing?
sure.
So we had been talking before, and I just want to make sure this definitely comes up. The other issue that I never thought about until we were in this room together was the issue of climate change, and if there's going to be infrastructure built with considering climate change in mind. So if you're going to be investing and building all of this infrastructure and it's going to be in flood zones where low-income families more typically live, then you really have to sort of consider that. Did you want to sort of just talk a little bit more about this? Because I think this is really something that maybe this is what tech companies could do, and I forgot to think about that before.
I mean, when it comes to access, there needs to be more than just putting lines in places where there isn't lines already. There should be a consideration of the effects of climate change. There should be a consideration of how do we harden these networks and make sure that they're robust enough to provide these communities that are maybe far away, disconnected geographically from other places, so that they have a really robust access, a port of access to the rest of the world. So those are special considerations on the infrastructure side that policymakers should definitely take into consideration.
And technology companies too, I think.
Yeah. Sorry, I know that.
Hi, my name is Bonnie Sutton, and I work with Genius, and actually it is a tech project by Cisco, Google, but you know what the problem is? We have funding, but testing takes up mentor time from schools. So from January until May, you cannot use the computers in the school. How do we solve the problem, that problem? Because it isn't that they don't want the kids to do the project, it's fabulous, but it's that they don't want you to use the computers because the testing information is on it, and so therefore you can't access the tech room.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised this point. Another policy consideration as we recognize the kind of whole ecosystem of educational policies and how they're affecting each other is that our standardized testing systems in our schools are challenging on so many levels. So they're certainly challenging in that the computers need to be kind of like locked down during this time, and you can't use them for more creative things or after school clubs or cool things that kids might want to do to become more digitally literate. You also have problems of teachers not being able to do the project-based learning that they want to do to really build more media literacy and information literacy in their students, where they feel more agency in what they're learning. So there's work to do on that front as well. I think that the answer to some of that, because it is complicated, and when we talk about testing and wanting to make sure we have outcomes data to show that we are getting to the kids that need the most help, is to have a much stronger line of communication between our schools, our libraries, our after-school programs, and our policymakers, so that they're seeing that this dynamic is happening, and bring it up at school board meetings and others, because I don't think it's even recognized that this is affecting
their own computer. We do that in our school
Right.
system. Maybe that they don't have to use those computers.
But they still have during the school day. Then they'll still have kind of like a lockdown situation where you can't do anything but test for these number of days.
From January through when?
Well, it depends on the
But it
system.
depends, yeah.
If you're in a low income,
Yeah.
you do the pre-test, the test before the test, the level but they have more technology.
They have more computers, yeah.
Where it doesn't.
Where they don't, so.
And this sort of comes to a bigger issue as well of thinking about even, you know, basic problems of app design. So we might think, okay, this would be a great app for a family. This will solve all sorts of problems. But and you know, doing testing on computers is a good idea because everything is entered quickly and we could maybe figure out things quickly. So all of these things are with the best intentions. But the issue that you're bringing up is a really basic one of storage. So where do you store data? So for apps, if you are having to record onto your phone, you might have a smartphone, but it has very little storage. So I think this is something more, also another thing that we could ask from technology companies is to think about designing even standardized testing so that storage is immediately uploaded to a secure cloud so that then the computers are able to be used, or that designing apps that information could be uploaded quickly to a storage platform rather than staying on the phone. However, this comes back to our privacy, sorry, I should say in this country, issue, which is like, so how do we know that that information can be deleted? So so I think this is one good thing about the GDPR regulations. I have some problems with some of them as well, but one of the good things is this need for hard delete. And I think having people become aware of this need for hard delete. So if you could get tech companies to design easy, cheap storage upload, design apps which have this quick storage upload and the option that is always hard delete. Those would be all of my top requests. If tech companies could just go ahead and solve those things, that would be great. And then in the school system, then computers, that hardware wouldn't be sort of tied up because of a storage or software limitation. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I was just going to add one more piece that had to do with the devices themselves. In many of the communities where we've done some of our work, very few have bring your own device type policies. But many of the programs that we work with, particularly in the marginalized communities, do not permit either the staff or the students to use their own phones, and they themselves don't have budgets to purchase equipment. So I know we can't solve all of that there, but there's some other ways and maybe in which policies can be better put to use, especially for proactive approaches in using these different resources that you're talking about. Because in some places, especially some of the places where it's needed most, they don't have policies that allow for even those kinds of devices to be brought in or used by staff.
Right.
When
I
they
mean,
don't have
prisons
it.
are a great example of that. Like, just no access whatsoever. Imagine if you were imprisoned in 2005 and suddenly released now, and you have no, just try to imagine it, and that you're being released into a completely different world. That is a huge problem, and across many different communities, thinking about, and even sometimes the provided devices, they're not the top of the line devices, right? So they're sometimes called the smartphones, they're sometimes called the dumb phones because they really are very limited in their functionality. So I think we have to sort of think about, I totally agree with what you said, is basically what I'm trying to say.
I think she's right here. Is somebody back there? Yeah, there's one more here. Go ahead, yes, please.
This reminds me of when Trump was talking, and
This is a wonderful day full of mind-blowing things. I'm on the Washington Advisory Board at Common Sense, also a PTA president. I feel like there's a need, and it's more of a question for everyone in the room in regards to their bioethicists who kind of help synthesize research, philosophy, policy, and I'm wondering, our universities, our educators, I know this is sort of a Common Sense is trying to do this in integrating all of you all to here today, but are there formal programs, interdisciplinary studies? Because I think even librarians, educators, heads of school, prison policymakers, all of us could benefit taking the research that even exists and figuring out what does it mean for society. So I just didn't know if you, in your educational world, know about developing programs, or is this a robust area of study? Because I think there's an interest there and a need, and I just wanted to know what I have a child going into college, and I want to push him
Well,
in.
there is a master's program. I mean, I'm at Georgetown, so I'm allowed to say there's a master program at Georgetown called Communication, Culture and Technology, which is, it's master's, but it is an interdisciplinary program that does try to take into a lot of different perspectives, and there's a lot of really good master's communications and PhD communications programs across the country. But I think you're right, this interdisciplinary piece. Also the ethics. Today a lot of this has been about the ethics of technology. And is that covered in CCT?
Right.
I don't even know. Is ethics covered in CCT? It must be. I mean, you sort of assume that it is, but I think you're exactly right that this has been an assumption.
It's a new.
Yeah.
Right.
Maybe you can teach it, Rachel.
I'm not.
Well, I
good at
think that
philosophy.
there are, and obviously, coming from the think tank as well, there are think tanks that are trying to do more of this and trying to kind of cross disciplines. And so there's a lot of, at New America, we do a lot of human-centered work. So in our kind of approach is a human-centered approach to technology in our Learning Tech program, and then we have a design group that works on public interest technology, which is also in that vein. But there's a lot more work to do to start making these connections across these disciplines. And I think what you're pointing to is doing it in a way where the public can be involved and hear and see and learn from and participate in, right? And so programs at the university level are great for like the next generation, but there's a need right now.
Yeah.
Like that's why this incredible conversation here today that Common Sense has held has been so important, because there really is a need right now to do this.
We should do this every month.
Sandy?
So, Sandy Calvert, Georgetown. I have a question about just education in general, because, one of the things is this conversation about national standards and testing and things like that. But, the different communities, and you've all pointed this out, that rural America, in terms of some of its needs, are very different from those of the inner city. And the populations are somewhat different. What kind of space do you see to address the needs of different kinds of communities that the school systems should do a better job of?
Well, I think that school systems are more and more aware of this, and there's more focus on whether it's using the buzzword of personalized learning and recognizing how to differentiate instruction with various populations or individual students, or learner variability, which is a word that Digital Promise is looking at and doing some surveying on. There's a recognition now that there needs to be more understanding of various communities and various subpopulations' needs. Whether we have the answers to exactly how to do that, I don't think so. I mean, and what we also have are some real huge variabilities in terms of funding. So in the education world, funding is mostly coming from state and local levels. And when it's based on property taxes, then you have even more variability there. So among developed countries, I think it's really kind of a travesty, honestly, that we still have this system where kind of depending on whether you live in a rich area or not, you can have your kids going to a place that's relatively well-resourced or not. And we have not solved that big problem here at all in this country.
So
but
that's
that goes
policy
exactly
question.
to what your point is, Sandy, that we're not recognizing of all the diversity of needs out there, and we certainly aren't funding that.
Yeah, but one thing that just to sort of on the flip side as well, to think about is in terms of training and providing training, we've really got to keep thinking about how can we maximize and capitalize on technology. So in terms of delivering information, remote training opportunities, using video chat, using even things like quizzes that can be automated so that people don't have to spend the time sort of grading the quiz, but they can spend the time and talking with a teacher about a new technique and so on. So again, if we can just also try and think how to use technology in a smart way to provide additional training to sort of maximize training, some of it remote, some of it in person, thinking about hybrid models, and then that might be a way to sort of at least reduce some of the disparities as well.
I wanted to add a question that we got from social media. Is it fair to put the burden on parents to police the internet when tech companies and social platforms can't moderate their own content effectively themselves?
Yeah, so I think that's a very fair question. So the Kids Act that was mentioned this morning, I think would go an awful long way to that. And tech companies taking increasing responsibility. I think that we definitely have heard a lot about that today, and that we need to keep pushing for that. But I think also in 2019, technology is such a huge part of family media ecology, family ecology in general, that parents also have to be involved. And one thing that we haven't really talked about today at all is our own use. And I think Cameron kind of alluded to it and said it's, his generation is so tied to it. But just quick show of hands, how many people have checked their email today? Many people have just quickly gone on a website. How many people? So we, as parents, are also using technology a lot ourselves. And I think earlier in the day, the issue of how we're, the Surgeon General, when he mentioned how we're modeling our behaviours to other children, so we can also take advantage of tech for that. So instead of the text going off, we can say, okay, it's playtime with the child, let's try a do not disturb. Or let's set a reminder so that Netflix doesn't run on 5 times and we forget because we're quickly trying to cook dinner or have a conversation with someone or have a shower or whatever as a parent. Let's use some of those things, because I think parents do have to be really involved, but we can't blame parents either, because parents are trying to solve for so many different issues all the time, and particularly families who have got less resources to do so. Yeah. So my answer is no, parents shouldn't all be responsible for all of this. They do need to be mindful about their own media use. Tech companies do need to take more responsibility, and hopefully Senator Markey will just pass that Kids Act as well, and that would be great.
Yeah, I'll just throw in one more thing on that, and just that I, as a parent as well, think it's been really unfair that we have been expecting that parents can figure all this out.
Yes.
This is the first generation of parents to be dealing with this. I have teenagers. It is not easy, and we don't have guides. We don't know who to go to. That's why I think this idea of media mentors, of people who are really trained in helping families and finding and curating materials and knowing where the good resources are, can be incredibly helpful in the 21st century, and being able to kind of go to resources like we've heard here would be so useful to parents.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. It sounds like there's homework for everyone involved, right? For parents, for policymakers, but also for the tech companies themselves.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.